On Facebook Live is Shaka himself, aka the Kabale Kid. Hello, Shaka.
Hello, Paul.
Welcome again.
Thank you very much. I'm hugely terrific to be here once again.
And a warm welcome to our all our Facebook followers watching us live on Facebook. Shaka Extra Time is a place where you get to ask some serious questions. And right now, Shaka is taking your questions. Let me start with maybe something that is happening here at home. A lot of people are still talking about President Donald Trump firing his FBI director. But when you look at most places in Africa where we come from, something like that is really not a big deal. People get fired all the time, people get hired. So break it down for us or put it in context for some of our viewers.
That is very true, except perhaps with the exception of South Africa, if you remember. You know that President Jacob Zuma sacked the former finance minister, Godam, and you know, everybody was talking about it, or seemed to be talking about it, even though the man is constitutionally mandated to decide who should be in his cabinet and to sack whoever he wants. How, you know, whenever he wants, and whether he thinks that is justified.
So what does it take really for somebody? Is it about royalty? Is it about merit? Is it about somebody who has to serve the country's interests?
In this particular case, I think it is even much more than that. There's some people who have been testifying on Congress and have actually been saying or suggesting that the new president of the United States, Mr. Donald Trump, seems to be assaulting the system of checks and balances in this government, which is the separation of powers. In the particular case of Comey, he obviously was the director of FBI, and according to the Constitution, the president has the right to decide, frankly, who should be his director of the FBI. But in this particular case, he fired Comey at a time that probably is viewed by some to be inappropriate. You have a sensitive issue that is under investigation, and you have the Congress, you know, conducting hearings about the role that Russia may have played in the last presidential elections. And Comey obviously is a very key player in that particular hearing. And the name of the current president, Donald Trump, he surfaces because there are allegations that he had actually been interacting with some Russian officials. And as you know, there's a lot of evidence suggesting that the Russians, in fact, may have hacked or may have been tried to influence who becomes the president of the United States. So it's the issue of perception. And when it comes to politics, perception happens to be reality.
Maybe explain to our viewers what this means in a sense that a president, like you rightly said, has the right to fire and hire whoever he wants, but maybe put it in some context here for African viewers or people in third world who look at this and they say, wow, even in America things like this happen. How would you explain that to somebody who is always looked up to America and now they're like questioning this kind of move?
It is a bit confusing because it is only in some African countries, probably a lot of the African countries, where a president, for example, could actually go to a television station or talk to a radio broadcaster and say that as of now, or with immediate effect, I have sacked Paul Ndiho. And Paul Ndiho will in fact only hear that information through public broadcasting or commercial broadcasting without necessarily being informed or consulted by the appointing authority. President Moi, for example, used to have a reputation of doing that. He would fire ministers when he's crisscrossing the country, and people would simply hear their fate via either the radio station, television station, or some people who had actually had they broadcast news. Now, when it comes to the United States, or in a society, frankly, which is considered to enjoy what many people would characterize as a mature democracy, those things do not seem to happen. You have a situation where perhaps there will be some conflict between the appointing authority and a cabinet minister or a very high government senior official. And all the president will do is, you know what? I don't honestly think that we can continue working together. So why don't you do me a favor? Why don't you, in fact, write a letter of resignation, which I will very, very politely accept so that you can exit.
So in this particular case, Comey saw himself being fired on TV. So which sort of reminds me of exactly what you just talked about, where African leaders fire some of these guys just like that.
That is very true. But then again, you're talking about societies or countries, frankly, where individuals have very significant powers, where individuals, in fact, have become more or less substitutes of weak institutions. They become a sort of institution themselves. When it comes to mature democracies like the United States, a country like the US is not run by an individual or individuals. It is run on the basis of strong institutions. And there is some kind of, respect for one another and what have you. And so there is a sort of gentleman agreement, if you will, that you reach a point and where you cannot work with someone else, you ask them to write a letter of resignation. If they don't want to write a letter of resignation, then obviously they leave you with no option but to fire them. And you fire them gently, but firmly.
But then what would you say to people who say that, oh, you know what, Comey is firing? A lot of Democrats, in fact, are calling for the impeachment of a president. Isn't it too early, really, to be even talking about impeachment of a president? Because based on the firing of one of his top aides.
Well, maybe politically they may be smelling what they would see as blood. Because when you look at the process that is undergoing, you're talking about investigations and hearings about the Russian role and what have you. Maybe there is more than meets the eye. Maybe there is more that they know that you and I do not really have the privilege or do not have access. And therefore, they may be, of course, overreacting, but probably they're smelling some sort of blood.
Yeah, so let's go to our comments. Let's start with a comment from Levicato in Abidjan. He says, what can African governments do to overcome this mutiny style, in quotes? For example, what's taking place in Ivory Coast?
First of all, the issue of soldiers really going on in a mutiny simply because of, money is owed to them, I have to admit is not very common on the continent. But there are some countries where, of course, that has happened. I remember back in 1964, I was a kid. There was what you would call a mutiny of the King's African Rifles. In Uganda, it was called the 4th King's African Rifles. And then you had, of course, the other battalions in Kenya and then Tanganyika. I remember when the Minister of Defense, or responsible for defense, one Felix Onama, when he went to Jinja, where you and I had the privilege of, living, he was immediately arrested by the soldiers, and he was put in the quarter guard, and they told him to sign certain documents so that their pay could be increased. And eventually, in the Ugandan case, they bowed to the demands of the soldiers. They basically increased their pay. They did not take any other decisive action against the mutinying troops. The mutinying troops went back to the barracks, stayed in the barracks, and continued serving in their positions. And guess what? It was less than, 7 years later that you actually have a successful military coup led by the then Major General Idi Amin Dada against President Milton Obote. In the case of Tanganyika at the time, the founding president, Mwalimu Julius Kambarage Nyerere, what he did, he invited the British troops who disarmed the mutinying army. And then he disbanded the army and recruited younger people who had loyalty to the ruling party. You never experienced a coup in what later became Tanzania. In Kenya, they also brought in the Muzungu troops and all that kind of stuff, and the rest is history. Now, in the case of Ivory Coast, it is very interesting because these are the same troops, as a matter of fact, that eventually helped to propel incumbent president Alassane Ouattara to power in Yamoussoukro. Yamoussoukro, of course, is the capital of the Ivory Coast, even though everything is conducted in the commercial capital of Abidjan. You also have a very interesting figure whose name so far I haven't heard, is Guillaume Soro, a young man.
He's the Speaker of Parliament, so
he is the president of the National Assembly. According to the previous constitution, or the French constitution if it were, he would be the number 2 man. So he was in fact in a position to succeed President Alassane Ouattara if something should happen to him. But what Ouattara did, he outmaneuvered him politically and conducted a sort of referendum, a referendum that was very much criticized by a lot of observers, by the way. And that referendum helped to amend some very significant aspect of the Constitution of Ivory Coast, which introduced the position of vice president, who constitutionally is in a position to be the next president, becomes in fact a heartbeat away from the presidency, and that makes Soro a little bit irrelevant, or at least number 3 in the pecking order. Now, Soro had served earlier a little bit as prime minister under the National Unity Government, which was, of course, headed by then President Laurent Gbagbo. You remember that for so many years. And he obviously still retains, from what I hear, the royalty of some of these soldiers. So it's probably not just simply about money. And you know what? I don't think that the government, frankly, of Alassane Ouattara is probably coming up with adequate solutions. These soldiers, they go on mutiny, they demand money, you pay them. Another time they demand money, you decide that no, you are sending troops to disarm them. The troops go to disarm them. They cannot accomplish that. And therefore, who actually now is the victor here? The rebels are the victors because you pay them and they stay in the barracks. And they know that next time they want something even greater, they can still get it. So who is in charge as we talk now?
Yeah, but how can a situation like this be averted? What can President Alassane Ouattara do in this particular case? Because it has happened before. This is the second time. Who says it might not happen tomorrow?
That is correct. I think part of the problem he has is that he obviously promised to solve their short-term solution, which was each of them demanding really about the equivalent, I think, of US $20,000. He paid a bit of that in January earlier this year, and he had promised to pay later. He did not. So I think what really should happen is that the governments should be able to pay their soldiers, pay their civil servants, and pay them not only well, reasonably well, and also make sure that they pay them on time so that these people, frankly, can take care of the welfare of their families. Because let's face it, You may tell the soldiers that you do not have the money to pay them, and yet you and your ministers, your senior government officials are flying first class around the world, sleeping in 5-star hotels. You know, basically all that on the back of the average Ivorian. These soldiers are not ignorant. These soldiers are exposed. They know what is going on, and they feel that they have a right to be treated as professional soldiers. And so I think you really have to make sure that you treat your soldiers professionally. You treat them in a manner that makes them feel that they belong, and they also have a sense of pride. They feel that they are legitimate citizens of that particular society, and they feel very proud to serve their nation in those roles. So you have to work out, make sure that you motivate people. You have to make sure that people feel comfortable about what they are supposed to do. People need some respect. Everybody has egos after all.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect segue to maybe Kenya. We've had similar situations in this particular case. Doctors, medical professionals, even to some extent lawyers protesting over minimum pay, so many other things. And they're having elections are coming up towards in September.
In August.
Or August, rather.
August 8th, to be precise.
Yeah, but so there is so much politicking going on, so much campaigning going on. Could this be a precursor to what we might see in Kenya?
It is very interesting, except that, of course, in Kenya, the teachers do not have AK-47. The doctors do not have AK-47. Well, you see, in most of Africa, it is the security forces, for example, that are a significant institution that is very coherent, very disciplined, in such a way that only one person can say left turn, and they turn left. Another person says shoot, and they shoot. So you are a doctor. You probably may want to deny medical services to ordinary people, but these are victims. They're victims of people who are, you know, in charge of the government. You are a teacher. You want to deny services to young people who are going to school, including your own children. These are victims. It is not the government. But if you had a gun, it would make a difference. But at the end of the day, who knows? You could have a situation where you have the teachers, you have the doctors, you have the civil servants, and then you also have the security forces joining the same people. If that happens, that would be the beginning of the end of a government in place at that point in time. And it has happened in some countries elsewhere on the continent and in Europe.
Yeah, still in Kenya, a lot of analysts, a lot of observers are saying that this is going to be a deja vu again between Raila and President Uhuru Kenyatta. Your thoughts?
First of all, of course, it is deja vu. Yeah. There's no doubt about that, because the two major parties, Jubilee has already nominated President Uhuru Kenyatta for a second term. It is also true that the coalition, which is named NASA, has also nominated Raila Amolo Odinga to be the flag bearer. So it is deja vu. Now, is it about, is the question about who do I actually think is likely to be the next occupant of State House Nairobi? I think it would be too presumptuous, frankly. It is still a little bit too early for me to get into that area. But from some of the indicators I am looking at, it is increasingly looking like going to be a very competitive election. To the extent that if the election in fact ends up being, or at least having a semblance of being free, fair, credible, and transparent, I wouldn't be surprised, for example, if neither of the two candidates hits the magic number in the first round of 50 plus 1 vote, so that it could actually go in second round. And you know what? There could be a new kid on the block. Because when you look at the fact that you are beginning to see a shortage of unga, ugali,
a staple food in
precisely.
Kenya. Yeah.
Almost every Kenyan, frankly, depends on that. Not like Uganda, where a lot of people, depend on matoke, potatoes, and what have you, wimbi, you name it. In Kenya, for the most part, it is ugali. Just like in Tanzania, it is rice. Now, there is a saying that perhaps what you are beginning to see is what they call the ugali revolution. The ugali revolution. Milk, for example, is now, from what I have seen, costing, can you believe, a little more than gasoline, than petrol. Milk. Oh. And guess what? You know who actually owns the single largest dairy industry in Kenya?
The president.
Well, at least the presidents of family, the Kenyatta family, the Brookside, which is based, I think, in Westlands and what have you. So, my friend, watch out.
Interesting. Now that brings me to an interesting comment here from Alan Billy. Shaka, don't you think that democracy is a failed project for African nations? I'm asking this because there has never been an election conducted in any African country without disputes. For example, whenever we have a loser, it's because the loser's votes were already stolen, and whenever there is a winner, it's only that winner who says the elections are free, fair, and credible. Your thoughts?
First of all, I do not agree that, I do not agree really about the premise of the question that there has never been in Africa where you have had an election where people have, had disagreements and stuff like that. There have been very clear-cut situations. We have some blind spots, Paul. We have, in fact, recently we had an election, for example, in Benin.
Ghana.
There was no problem. We had an election in Ghana. There was no problem. We had an election earlier even in Nigeria, the most populous nation on the African continent. There was no problem. We had elections in Senegal. There was no problem. We had elections in Zambia, much earlier than this one won by Lungu. There was an election, I think, in 2011, where an incumbent president, Rupia Banda, was defeated, which is very, very rare in most African countries where incumbents actually are also running for re-election. But this gentleman conceded defeat with grace. And I remember the first time I met him was at Dar es Salaam State House. I had gone, in fact, to interview then President Jakaya Mrisho Kikwete. And I thanked him for actually what he did. And I told him, I said, you know what? You did not lose that election. Democracy won. And in fact, so did Africa. So I think you should consider yourself a champion of democracy as far as Africa is concerned. When it comes to democracy, whether or not it is appropriate for Africa or whether it has failed, I think, frankly, we should be a little bit patient. I think the jury is still out. Democracy, first of all, my brother, is a process. It's neither an incident nor an event. There was a time when Latin America used to play ball democratically, just like the way Africa is doing right now. You cannot hear anybody criticizing an election in Latin America. So I think that Africa also, one of these days, it will get there.
Okay, speaking of Africa, let's stay in Nigeria. People are wondering what's going on with President Buhari. We have a comment here from Abado Peter Tadro. Mr. Shaka, what do you think about Nigeria's president health-related issues? Should Nigerians be concerned about his health?
Well, they should, but we have been assured by at least, his presidential aides that there should really be no alarm. And I think that we shouldn't be alarmed about it until, in fact, we are told by the appropriate authorities what is the exact status of President, Major General, Muhammadu Buhari retired, but not tired. He says that he's feeling much better than he did. For example, the last time when he was in London, I should point out that he's back in London for another checkup. But the interesting thing, at least about this presidency, which is different from, for example, the difference of Yaradua. The difference is when Yaradua would be sick, he would not, for example, hand over power to his vice president. And when he actually died, there was a lot of problem in terms of succession. Let's face it, when you look at the Nigerian constitution, it is very clear, it's unambiguous, that a vice president succeeds the president if that president should die in office or that president is incapacitated. In this particular case, I think in fairness to General Buhari, he basically hands over power, the instruments of power, to his vice president when he's out. So I don't think, frankly, we should be alarmed about it until we get the appropriate statement from the appropriate authorities.
From Nigeria to Uganda now, of course, Shaka, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the passing of an icon in the Ugandan politics called Mr. Boniface Byanyima. You have a lot of comments from Uganda, and people want to know what you make of the passing of this gentleman and your thoughts.
First of all, Mr. Boniface Byanyima was a distinguished Ugandan, a distinguished public official, a person who for many years was in the business of education. Among others, he was the head teacher at Mbarara High School in southwestern Uganda when a young kid known as Yoweri Tibuhaburwa Museveni was in high school. This man later becomes president. This man will be known for having been very principled, where there were very few people in terms of politics who were principled, but very, very stubborn, very fiercely independent-minded, but a man who embraced really the virtues of social economic justice for all. So I think that Uganda will definitely miss him. But let's face it, the man lived a full life. At 97, come on, man. May his soul rest in eternal peace.
What are you talking about tomorrow on Straight Talk Africa?
Tomorrow we're going to West Africa. We'll be talking about the upcoming elections in Liberia. And the key guest in the studio will be Ambassador Macdela Hooper, a world-class, renowned model. And she will be in the studio and tell us about her foundation and all that kind of stuff. She seems to be doing actually great things in Liberia. She has also a very interesting story because she was one time, as a very young girl, a refugee in the Ivory Coast.
Actually, we still have time for one quick question. Still in Liberia, let's go to Sam Musa. How do you how do you view the Liberian elections coming up?
Well, I really don't know because, first of all, the question is the playing field leveled? I am still trying to find out that. Maybe after the show, let's deal with that question next week. But I saw something on Eritrea, and people wondering whether there was democracy there or dictatorship. I can only say...
Very quickly.
I can only say that what you have in Eritrea, frankly, is a government of some people, by some people, for some people. If that is what you call democracy or dictatorship, it is your call.
On that note, thank you so much, Shaka, again for being a great guest. I'll see you next week on another edition of Shaka Extra Time.
You're most welcome, sir.
Thank you.